Howdy, Marc.
Hey, good afternoon, Julian. And so let me just get my video sorted out and I'll be with you in 1 second.
Sure thing. Sure. So, Suresh, I did as good a job as I could in the course of like a newsletter's expected level of density about what Singapore EDP does. But you guys are all over this agenda in various places. Tonight, or today rather, and then tomorrow, Eugene and I are going to recap the day. And I tell people about what Singapore EDP does, and I'm curious how you answer that question, because I know that you are extremely helpful in helping folks make sure that they understand the region properly, get off on the right foot, help find the right vendors and partners, and make sure that no one's not doing business with anybody that wouldn't be right for them. But what else do you guys get into? Because I know that quite a few people, I'd be shocked if folks hadn't used you before, if they've been in Asia and chatted you up about making big decisions. But tell us a little bit more about Singapore EDP.
Sure, happy to. So the Singapore EDP, or Economic Development Board, we're really the investment promotion and facilitation agency in Singapore that helps companies set up in Singapore and do business here. So as you mentioned, we have a few different panelists from EDP over the course of the 2 days. And I think that's very reflective of the different things that the various teams in EDP do. For myself personally, I'm from the Southeast Asia team. And what we do is we help companies that are either already in Singapore or looking to be based in Singapore find regional solutions to their operations. This is a bit counterintuitive to what I described EDP's mandate to be, which is to secure investment in Singapore. But I think increasingly we realize that for Singapore to be successful, Southeast Asia needs to be successful. The opportunity for companies is in tapping into the opportunities that are in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, it's made up of 10 countries. It's a population of about 650 million people, which is larger than North America. It's got a $3.2 trillion economy, which is the 5th largest in the world. So, I mean, if you just put those few statistics together, it kind of shows the opportunity for companies that are looking to be based in Singapore to tap into a Southeast Asia market. And that's where really my team comes in to help companies make sense of the region. And as you said, Julian, to help companies find the right partners to work with, because I think sometimes for companies entering Southeast Asia for the first time, that can be a bit challenging. Who are the right partners? Who are the right companies? It can be quite a complex landscape. And I think even at a sub-regional level, within individual countries, there are intricacies and there are dynamics to navigate. So that is part of what our team does, which is to help companies kind of navigate that landscape, I would say, and effectively do business in Southeast Asia.
And that is a perfect segue into introducing Marc Mealy, who does, for any of those countries to be successful, the region needs to be successful. I think that's a pretty tight kind of logic and value that US-ASEAN Business Council has, especially as it regards US companies operating in the region. And so you are, correct me if I'm wrong, US-ASEAN Business Council is the only business group outside the region to be written into the ASEAN Charter. Is that correct? Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah. And so it's got a very special place in Southeast Asia. And they stay close to what's going on the ground and play a productive role in the region and helping American companies make sense of it as well. And so we got someone who's there in sort of arguably the hub of all that activity, and playing a really helpful and productive and proactive role within the region. And then of course we've got Marc on the American side. So we've covered within the scope of this segment of programming sort of what's going on with the economics, what's going on once the ships and drop off their cargo at the port, things like that. I know that a lot of people are looking at what's going on within Asia, both for operational, but also market-facing activities. And either they've been boosted by large revenues from the pandemic because they were a beneficiary industry in some form or fashion, and now they're looking at getting close to where the action is. A lot of those industries, digital industries, they want to be close to where the digital innovations are. And then from the operational point of view, because there hasn't been a whole lot of travel, there's probably been a lot of activity within the region that folks just have not seen. So that would affect their regional plans, that would affect, what they would do vis-a-vis Singapore, and certainly whether or not they should leave home from the United States or change the behavior if they're already there in some way in reaction to whatever global phenomena. So I would guess I want to start with you, Suresh. What do you see as like the most surprising things that have changed over the last 2 years since the pandemic became a reality that folks should know about, that have changed the region in meaningful ways?
Yep. So I think the pandemic has been a game changer. It really has. From a slightly less positive perspective, I would say the disruptions to travel. And I think in a pre-pandemic, and definitely we hope in a post-pandemic setting, one of the key advantages of being in Southeast Asia, or being based in Singapore to access Southeast Asia, is really how easily you can travel in the region. In a 3 to 5 hour flight radius, you're going to access the whole of Southeast Asia from Singapore. And if you extend that to 5 to 7 hours, you're essentially also including China, Japan, India, and Australia. And that's the kind of flight time it takes, I think, between the East Coast and West Coast of the US. So that, I think, is one of the primary advantages that continue to be there. Slightly disrupted during COVID, unfortunate, but I think we see that coming back, and the travel is coming back. But on a slightly more positive note, I would say the internet economy is really one of the booms that have, or inadvertently come out as one of the booms of the pandemic. It's projected to triple to about $300 billion by 2025. And actually, COVID has brought about a massive digital adaptation spurt with about 40 million new users in 2020 alone. And if you kind of extrapolate that a little bit, the number of internet users in Southeast Asia is expected to reach about 80% of the region's population. And that's about 575 million people by 2030. So therein itself, I think, kind of captures the opportunity in the digital sector, and actually not even in the digital sector, but even more traditional sectors like healthcare and others, where digitalization is making a difference and is bringing about a positive change.
Marc, what would you say are the things that you've seen transform, change in meaningful ways that folks who don't have the view into all of what's going on out there, that changes the way business ought to be considered for what companies would do when they get there?
No, I think, Suresh made a really good point, not only in terms of the continued growth sort of in the digital economy or internet economy, but we actually published I had a program earlier today to sort of launch the Temasek Bain Capital sort of, best regional summaries of ASEAN's digital economy trends and developments. And actually, one of the things that really struck me in that report was that not only is ASEAN and its member countries seeing, again, the continued steady growth of, people going online, et cetera, but in this most recent period, one of the fastest growing segments of populations in Southeast Asia going online, surprisingly, are in rural, non-urban areas. Hence, this really get into a much more deeper penetration, or in a sense, it's not just sort of the quantity of internet penetration, it's now we're getting to the quality. We're getting even beyond the urban areas. And we all know in many of these non-urban areas where there's only more opportunities to kind of bring digital products and services, because those market participants maybe have had less exposure. because they haven't been in the urban area, so to speak. So I think that's an even bode well for the continued potential of sort of that digital economy growth. Two other things I would mention. I think one, it's always good to know, like in terms of the bigger picture, you know, COVID has obviously had a negative impact on, you know, economic growth around the world. Southeast Asia is no different. But I think we would note that in Southeast Asia, even with COVID, the average regional GDP growth probably coming in around like 3% this year, and then still poised to go back to quote unquote the normal clip of between 4 and 5% going forward. Again, relative speaking to how COVID, you know, is managed. But I think that's always a product of some of that structural reality that ASEAN economies and markets really kind of have the benefits of both strong sort of domestic demand sources of economic growth, good rates of consumption, middle-class populations, those kind of things, as well as, of course, the role that ASEAN member states play in a number of global and regional supply chains. So as we all know, as demand kind of picked back up in developed markets, Southeast Asia and those economies, even with the tightness in global supplies, you know, we're really seeing rebound of some of their exports as well, which is another. And I think, and last but not least, you know, I mentioned this, you know, COVID has certainly increased the pace of digitalization. We're seeing great examples of, I mean, ASEAN's sort of one of their biggest unicorns, Grab, their super app, is likely going to go public in the United States soon, like this month, with a potential valuation of like $40 billion US. I've seen that estimated market sort of capitalism for Grab. I think that's again an example of the type of innovation that's taking place in Southeast Asia by Southeast Asian corporates. I think that's really bodes well. And even at the regional level, you know, ASEAN as a group of countries, different levels of development, et cetera, you know, oftentimes are driving, you know, sort of regional economic integration or cooperation efforts. And they got to do it the ASEAN way, because you have Singapore sometimes on one end, and you may have a less developed country like a Cambodia, Laos on the other end, but they all want to move together as 10 countries as a region. We're very excited, for example, that at that regional level, there is a quote unquote ASEAN regional e-commerce agreement, something which all 10 countries are sort of looking to sort of subscribe to some, how shall we say, some common practices across the region. And we were really excited the fact that as the leaders and policymakers kind of agreed on this framework, we saw the countries of Southeast Asia sit down with one private industry and other important stakeholders to actually build a very tangible and concrete roadmap for how this region is going to try to really implement that regional framework. I think that's also, again, very, very positive, because let's be candid, you know, in the Asia Pacific region, there's lots of quote unquote, you know, economic potential, digital growth, you know, Japan, India, China, et cetera. If ASEAN as a region can develop regional approaches to some of these, you know, cybersecurity or data privacy, these kinds of things, and potentially differentiate their regulatory environment, you know, from a China, from an India, they've kind of got a potential opportunity to really project their competitiveness and their attractiveness in this kind of post-COVID period in terms of, you know, e-commerce and digital development. Because obviously, you know, they don't have 1.some billion people, but as Suresh said, they've got over 600 million people, with almost everybody accessing the internet. That's a real market.
So let me ask you this, Marc. What is the appeal now, and how would that be changed if what you're talking about gets traction in the near future, right? Or close enough? Mm-hmm. What is the experience to a retailer or a D2C company that wants to get local or something like that?
Right, sure. Well, for those of us who kind of watch this region, and we know that for companies, global companies that may be looking at, you know, can we build sort of a regional strategy, you know, to tap into the market opportunities across multiple countries? You know, one of the first questions is, well, for my product or service, is the law, standards, regulatory environment, are they 10 different things across all 10 markets, right? Because if that's the case, it may become less attractive. But one of the things you can say about the 10 countries of Southeast Asia, in certain industries, the region has actually developed, regional standards, regional requirements, so to speak. So for certain industries, there really is like a regional market. You don't have to worry about, 10 different regulatory approvals in certain industries for certain products. So I think what's interesting about this digital dimension is that if ASEAN, that roadmap that I mentioned, to really efficiently and effectively implement this sort of regional e-commerce framework, I would anticipate one of the benefits would be that if you were, a European company, American company, and you were trying to leverage e-commerce based platforms to, penetrate the market, hopefully that regional framework will mean for some things, it's like one requirement will be applicable to all 10 ASEAN countries, as opposed to I've got to get 10 different approvals for this or for that or whatever. That's the potential. That's the potential that I'm talking about, because that would make it very much more appealing, probably more efficient, lower costs for commerce-based provider retailers to really say, I can put together a market or business development budget and really go after some of these opportunities using an e-commerce based kind of strategy.
So Suresh, e-commerce and digital industries in general, I mean, it's been a hot time for, talking about Grab. What do you see in terms of like consumer behaviors across the region? I know that it's like difficult to say, every country's different. They all speak, there's different languages. It's a polyglot, polycultural landscape. But what are you seeing that's really interesting that is starting to gain traction and is interesting for its implications on major industries or what companies can be doing with this? I'm going to ask an open-ended question like that, and I know that it's weird to ask open-ended questions, but there's been so much that's come out of Asia that the United States is like, good gravy, like what are they doing over there that's causing, now we got to play catch up with all these things. Live shopping, things like that. So what's popping up on your map as really hot right now?
So maybe to address that, I'll take a step back. And I think I'll outline the two primary lenses through which the EDP sees Southeast Asia. And this builds on the point that Marc made earlier. And the first is really Southeast Asia as a consumer market. It's the consumer market size is about $2 trillion. The middle class is expected to grow to about 65% by 2030. So what does this mean for businesses? It means that you have a favorable demographic. You have the opportunity to build brand loyalty early and sustain these customers for over the next 3 decades, because about 60% of the population is still under the age of 35. So that is the first lens through which I would view Southeast Asia. And the second is Southeast Asia as a production base. So the region being an alternative viable manufacturing locations for companies that are looking to reduce the reliance on a single source to kind of achieve the supply chain resiliency and responsiveness that they want. And we can delve into this a bit further, but if I just look at the manufacturing FDI in Southeast Asia, in a pre-COVID kind of setting, 2016 to 2019, it's growing at about 31% CAGR, or about $70 billion. So, that's quite impressive. And I think that's definitely an opportunity there for countries. To, I guess, your more specific question in terms of, to drill that down, what does that mean? What does it mean in terms of opportunities? So, one of the recent reports that I came across, they kind of highlighted that in Southeast Asia, well, today you have about, I would say, between 20 to 25 unicorns or companies valued at over $1 billion. And that's expected to grow by over another 20 tech companies by the end of the decade, by 2029, of which 50% are likely to pursue IPOs. This essentially means that the current and the new tech unicorns in the region will create an additional about 400 billion in incremental equity by the end of the decade. So this is really, I think, a major opportunity for companies that are looking to see, how can I tap into Southeast Asia? What does Southeast Asia have to offer? And I mean, some of these statistics, I think, point to the opportunity that is there from a digital sector perspective.
Though you are really good with the figures, and do you have notes over there? Like, do you memorize these?
I was up last night prepping a little, I'm not going to lie, but I think these figures, for our customers and consumers who are less familiar with the region, I think the figures are a good way to kind of understand the trends, to kind of understand, where is the money flowing, how is the business taking place, what are the networks. So I think these figures kind of help to put a pin in that and then to help companies understand a bit better. Yeah,
I think so too. So yeah, I think, we just heard in the last session that I wish that I had, sometimes it's, should I like come in with a joke right here, because it's really kind of a funny thing, but like someone said, I'm all about, what I really want right now is just the standards. And I was like, you know what? It's hilarious to hear someone say that, because it doesn't feel like a sexy thing, but it really, in some ways, is. When you don't have to stress about going and dealing with one system and then another, and you could just go and be sure that the output that you want is going to get, you're going to get that with the input that you gave it. So, one of the things that I know that Marc and his group spend a lot of time hoping about and pushing for and advocating for are standards. And if they can play a role in helping them along, great. And if they exist, great. And then they communicate to their members about it, great. And one that I think we're all kind of kicking ourselves about over here is TPP. Yeah, that one's really a bummer. But RCEP got through, and even though it wasn't ours, the region likes it. What does, and CPTPP lives on in another manifestation. So it's not all bad. Doesn't happen with us, but we can still benefit. So.
I mean, Joe, you're diplomatically and eloquently hitting the nail on the head, in the sense that you're right. In spite of all of these things that are happening in the world, countries in Asia, particularly countries in Southeast Asia, are still finding the political will to move forward with basically the next generation of international trade initiatives. And I think you can make the argument that come January 1st, when the RCEP agreement sort of goes into force, goes live, and becomes the world's largest free trade agreement in terms of population, people who are included. RCEP, CPTPP, and we haven't even talked about some of the digital agreements that are also emerging in the region. DIPA. These, in my opinion, these are the real initiatives that are actually shaping the evolution of the regional trade architecture in the Asia Pacific region. The architecture is always evolving. And I think we're going to look back on this period and say CPTPP's continued presence and expansion, RCEP going into force and signed even during the midst of a global pandemic, and then some of these next generation digital agreements that the government of Singapore is involved in. We'll look back on this period of time and say, yeah, those were the kind of things that really kind of influenced and shaped the way commercial rules of the road are kind of done in the Asia Pacific region. And one thing that my organization is really watching very closely, because it ties into this whole question around resilient supply chains. And we know that's a priority for the American government, for countries around the world. One thing is very clear about the RCEP agreement is that because of the 15 countries that signed the agreement And I think we're roughly now at about 10 or 11 that have actually ratified it. So come January 1st, the 10 or 11 of the 15 will be able to start enjoying the benefits of the agreement, and the other remaining 2 or 3 or 4, hopefully they'll complete their ratification process so that their companies can start also benefiting from the agreement, because, you know, tariffs are going to be reduced, et cetera. But the rules of origin provisions in the RCEP agreement are going to make the regional cross-border movement of goods more predictable, more transparent, and potentially, obviously, because of the preferential market access opportunities, at lower costs. So I would dare so make the argument that when we talk about the evolution of supply chains, how to make them more resilient, we know things that are going on in Asia, you know, have broader global implications. I think we may see some evolutions in the regional supply chains, partially influenced by, again, the RCEP agreement going into force, because it's going to make doing business by companies within Asia maybe that much a little bit easier, particularly at a time like this, you know, coming out of the pandemic, et cetera, that could be a nice boost, again, for companies within the Asia Pacific region, foreign or local, relative to companies and operations outside of the Asia Pacific, outside of the RCEP, preferential free trade area. So I think that's going to be something which, you know, is going to have to be watched how it evolves. I mean, obviously, I don't expect, you know, day one, all of a sudden, all trade in the region is going to be going through the RCEP framework. We all know it takes time for businesses to start utilizing these new agreements, for governments to put in place the revisions in customs and those kinds of things. But, you know, 12 months from now, 24 months from now, I think we may see, again, a degree of easier trade flows within Asia because of RCEP that we don't currently see today. And I think that'll be one of the things that will have global implications.
And I think everybody's in the mood to have something be easier, even if it's 12 months away, right? Like that was just coming out of the last session with the Port of Long Beach and Weston Labar from Cargomatic and John Gold from NRF, right? Like folks have just had it. We had the Trump tariffs, we got this, like pandemic, US-China stuff is freaking everybody out. Like, you know, we just need a little bit of relief here. And if RCEP's going to do it, and CPTPP coming into effect, and like
expanding.
Expanding.
Well, because supposedly the UK may be, quote unquote, the next member of CPTPP. I actually think our friends in the government of Thailand have been doing a lot of work around potentially trying to also accede to CPTPP. So it's that expansion of CPTPP to even additional markets, which we've already seen what that agreement has done in terms of trade flows within CPTPP member nations. Countries like Vietnam have really seen a nice uptick in their exports to fellow CPTPP markets, so to speak, and also with their EU FTA. Certain industries in Vietnam have done really well, even during COVID, because of the preferential market access they have to the European Union under the EU-Vietnam FTA. So these are the kind of things that are, like you said, a little bit of relief right now for business, you know, can be really, really valuable.
Yeah, Julian, if I can just pick up on the point about regional trade flows that Marc mentioned. I mean, I think that's a great point. And I think that's a development that Singapore is very supportive of. And the reason really is that we realize, I mean, Singapore is a small country. We're about the size of New York. So I mean, for us, talent is our lifeblood. When it comes to something that's a bit more land and labor intensive, we know we have limitations, and that's really where we try to work a bit more closely with our region in. So one of the things that Singapore does, you know, or the EDB has been promoting is a Singapore Plus training strategy that's really helping companies to, you know, how can you get the best out of the region? You know, what would you look at to Singapore to do for you? And this could be something, I guess, something high up the value chain when it comes to more advanced manufacturing or something in R&D or innovation space. And how do you complement that with manufacturing in the region, in neighboring regions like Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Vietnam? So just earlier this year, we launched a new initiative, the Southeast Asia Manufacturing Alliance, that is designed to help companies do exactly that, to invest in manufacturing in Southeast Asia, while still kind of tapping on the innovation, the R&D functions, the HQ functions that you can cite in Singapore, and kind of get the best out of the region. So, as Marc said, as we have more of the regional trade flow agreements come into place, as it becomes easier for companies to do business in the region, to ship goods across different jurisdictions, these kind of programs would then further facilitate, how businesses can operate in Southeast Asia. If I'm going to draw a very rough or press parallel, it's kind of similar to how I think in the US you have, for example, manufacturing hubs between San Diego and Tijuana, or El Paso and Juarez. It's something similar when we look at, let's say, Singapore and the Batam Bintan Islands in the south, or Singapore and Johor in the north, and even further afield, like in Ho Chi Minh and in Hanoi. So these are some of the partnerships that we are establishing to kind of help companies navigate the region a bit better and to do business here.
Yeah, and something I'm also kind of curious about, differentials like those and combinations of needs is, what's going on with the local hiring scene? To make sense of Asia and Southeast Asia in particular, you've really got to have people who know how the place works, right? And it's a complex place, but there's a lot of real great upside, but again, both from the operational side and the market facing side. But for instance, we've got our global search for talent going on here. What do you see going on with talent in the Southeast Asian region and in Singapore in particular for really high skilled folks?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely an opportunity. I think you have seen a lot of companies that have set up operations in Singapore. For example, I think, when the pandemic hit and I think Zoom's business really took off, Zoom set up, its second data center in Singapore, and it opened the R&D hub here as well, which is in the works of, I think, hiring hundreds of people in engineering roles. And Twitter has done the same. So you do see quite a number of tech companies that are setting up their regional HQ roles here, hiring in higher end engineering roles. And going back to what I mentioned about the complementarity with the region, one of the things we're doing is working very closely with the Nongsa Digital Park in Batam, where companies can also hire workers there, Indonesian workers based in Indonesia, to kind of support the growing tech teams out of Singapore. So this is one of the mechanisms where you can mix and match the talent based on what you need. Within Singapore itself, talent is always a crunch. They have the government is working closely with the industry, and we've launched a few initiatives such as the Tech Skills Accelerator, which is really to help both your Infocom tech workers and non-Infocom tech workers kind of upskill, reskill to kind of join this new digital workforce. Concurrently, we're also helping companies that want to set up in Singapore for the first time, make it easier to bring in talent that you need to augment the staff that you have in Singapore. And these are through initiatives such as Tech at SG. So it's really a mix and match strategy, I would say, but it's about making life easier for businesses. And I think that is what Singapore and EDB's focus is on.
Excellent. And so, Chuen, it's great to have you up. If you want to join, yeah, I sent you that note that unfortunately your co-panelist not feeling well at all. So if we could keep a round robin here, actually, Suresh, if you could, are you able to stick around for just a little bit, Marc?
Yep, absolutely.
Sure, I got about 10, 15 more minutes, sure.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So one of the things that I was going to ask you guys about was how does this all play into the regional connectedness? Of course, we just talked about RCEP, CPTPP, and things like that. But that was all to pave the way for what we were about to get into with Chuen, which is about like the actual supply chain and getting it done and the actual movement of goods and people and services and so on. So what do you see in Chuen? We've got these agreements, we've got various regional standards that have been implemented before. What does this do for the movement of goods and services and the ease of doing business in Southeast Asia and from Asia to the world even?
Yes, thank you, Julian, and glad to be here with all of you today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. I just kind of jumped into it. We're in the middle of
No problem.
Sorry about that.
No, I think for Southeast Asia, I think you would have heard from Suresh and probably Marc earlier about the potential of the region. So I think now when you talk about connectivity, it's really about trying to get the various countries to level up, their infrastructure, to make sure that the operations, the movement of goods is as seamless as possible. So we have been doing that with the whole ASEAN economic community to try to get the various Southeast Asia countries to improve on all the processes that involves whether it's the customs, regulations, what's being done at airports, seaports. So maybe just to highlight one example, I'm not sure whether Suresh has shared this earlier. We are working very closely with, in fact, Suresh's team to look at how we can improve the connectivity between Batam and Singapore. So Batam obviously doesn't have as large an airport or a large seaport compared to Singapore, but it's located really closely to Singapore. So in order to make that value proposition of using Batam, for instance, more viable for companies, then we've worked quite closely with the port in Batam to ensure that there could be better connections, frequency of shipping between Singapore and Batam, so that companies who are manufacturing in Batam can then use Singapore's airport or seaport for onward distribution. So I think we are working on initiatives like this one at a time to continuously improve the connectivity within the region, particularly the ones that are adjacent to Singapore. And there are a few more things that we are planning, but obviously still very much work in progress. And I think once you get the connectivity up and going, then companies will find that it's going to be more seamless. I just looked up and I saw that, for instance, the Japanese and the Chinese and many other countries who are invested in Southeast Asia, they are also looking at how to improve the infrastructure within Southeast Asia. And that could be, whether is it transit rail lines or the seaports or the airports. And once you have those investments coming in over the next decade, the connectivity within the region is going to improve, and that will really lift the entire region's proposition to other companies.
What do you see within each of the nodes too, like investments in robotics, automation? Is there anything else going on that you've noticed? And maybe Marc, if any of your members or folks that you've been chatting with have been watching this too, I'd be curious about what you know. But which one? So like, what in terms of modernization and automation and digital transformation in each of these areas, like what do you see the most as regards supply chain?
I think in the go ahead.
Please.
No, I mean, they're certainly at the both regional and national government level. I think governments, one, see the value sort of in some of these digitalization processes, particularly like in terms of manufacturing and maybe even more advanced manufacturing. So we're seeing the creation of once again sort of national strategies for Industry 4.0 implementation, et cetera, et cetera. We're seeing efforts to really say, we really need to strengthen our overall kind of ecosystems. In other words, the institutions, the standards, the policies, the regulations, and of course, the human resources, the talent, if we really want to be able to see either attract foreign players to come into our economies and or, build the kind of ecosystem that enable local players, the future unicorns of Southeast Asia to emerge in some of these different areas. So we're seeing those kinds of positive trends are certainly, moving forward in the region. And, I think at the end of the day, there's opportunities, for companies that can really deliver products and services that can help support those kind of transitions, those kinds of evolutions, particularly within existing enterprises. So as you said, someone who's been a supplier, to Intel for decades, so they know the business, right? They know the operations, they make quality product services. What if they decided that, maybe there's an opportunity to, bring in more robotics into their overall kind of processes? Then it becomes a question of, what are the obstacles they face? Who are the providers that can really work with them to guide them on that sort of transition? I think that's where, again, there's some opportunities that are going to take place in a number of ASEAN countries, because already that foundation is very well established. We know a number of economies in the region are some of the world's most advanced manufacturing, destinations in many, many industries. So from that foundation and governments thinking in terms of what kinds of, policy environments they need, then it becomes, I think, an opportunity, who can really successfully say, I've got the products, I've got the services, I've got the solutions that can help your companies really, quote unquote, go industry 4.0. I know the nomenclature is probably dated, but to really sort of digitize, your manufacturing operations. So I think that's, again, a great potential for a number of markets.
What's your view, Chuen?
I think for Southeast Asia, it's going to be quite varied. For instance, in Singapore, as Suresh mentioned earlier, the cost probably is slightly higher than other countries. So when you look at the hiring of talents, you're going to hire people who can, be with higher levels of skills, are able to operate more machines. One person operating 10 machines, and that means that the manufacturing facility can be a lot more automated, more enabled by IF 4.0. But if you go into another country where the cost of labor is much lower, then the return on investment for automation is going to be more challenging. So the question for many companies is, what is the automation or what is the robotics going to help you achieve? Is it because you can't, find cost competitive workers, or is it because you are also in the process of industrializing and making sure that your facilities are now being able to produce more, being able to still achieve a very high level of quality, and hence you are investing in that automation. So I think the starting point for companies would be looking at what that automation or robotics is going to solve for you. Is it purely a replacement of labor, or is it going to help you achieve something else? And I think what I see in warehouses, maybe just one example, is that in warehouses in the past, I think if you wanted to invest in something like an ASRS, it's going to cost you $10, $20 million. And you're going to need to have a very strong business case, so commercial contracts with your customers got to be 3 to 5 years or 5 years to 7 years for you to make that return on investments. So companies are perhaps a bit hesitant in investing in that. Now you've got robotics in the form of autonomous mobile robots. You've got, the likes of Kiva Systems. In China, it's Geek Plus. And if as per what we are seeing throughout the pandemic, where the demand for goods are growing and e-commerce is booming, you may have to consider the robots to help you, because at some point you can't quite scale from, say, 10,000 pieces to 100,000 pieces just by putting more people on the job. So robots are going to help you solve those problems. And you can see in the US, right, where you see the likes of Walmart, Amazon, all increasing minimum wage for warehouse workers, but still having to invest a lot in automation, because the volumes coming through are not going to be able to be solved just by throwing more labor at the problem. So I think within Southeast Asia, it's going to be quite a diverse operating environment, and you've got to go into the location and see, okay, what is that country going to be able to provide me, and do I need to augment that with automation and robotics? So for Singapore, clearly we are pushing for automation and robotics because we think that that actually is going to help us augment that kind of scarce talent and labor workforce that we have in Singapore.
I think the reason why that comes up from time to time in, say, the e-commerce logistics landscape is simply being able to, so long, Mark. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for sticking around a little bit longer. Really appreciate
pleasure,
you.
folks. Take care, everybody. All right, ciao, everybody. Take care.
Is efficiency, really, just being able to know exactly when something is done, because there, as we've seen from so much pressure here in the entire supply chain, being able to count on when and how and under what circumstances and where is this whole thing, and all of that is it's just got a lot more focus than it has in the past. But you know, you see a lot of cases where humans do that just great, right? Like the what are they called? In Mumbai, the delivery lunches, complex system of delivery, and they go and they teach people Six Sigma courses all over the world about this. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? No. Anyway, the point is that this can be achieved, and especially with experience and good management, you can get exactly the right outcomes. So I suppose with those as the two, sides of that equation, or two sides of the continuum, rather. So low skill or presumed low skill, which can actually be high skill depending on where you go and what you do with it, but entirely human. And then on the other side, robotics, but extremely expensive, like you just said, and needs a good business case on the other. But it does give the certain kinds of precision of outcomes and things like that that a lot of folks are wanting right now. Is there any part of this that's arriving on your doorstep now that warrants either comment here or to push back the way that you did a second ago of like, well, what problem are you actually trying to solve?
Yeah, so at least for what we see in just the logistics sector. So in Singapore we have got a very vast manufacturing sector, very clearly needing to continue to automate. And when you're manufacturing products, it can be quite a little bit straightforward, especially if you're talking about high volumes, low mix. In Singapore, it's a bit more complicated. We tend to do higher value products, higher mix, and maybe slightly lower volumes. There has been a huge push to towards Industry 4.0 in that respect. Where I cover, when I look at the logistics sector, and we are talking about warehouses, distribution hubs, we are at a tipping point, I think, and if I can be quite open here, we've been able to operate some of these warehouses fairly manually. So we have been able to get the kind of workers that we need to pick and place products within a warehouse. And my team is now looking at how do we catalyze that, because the next stage or next phase is that we are going to see growth in volumes because of growth in consumption in Southeast Asia. Many companies are using Singapore as a hub to distribute goods out of Singapore because of the great connectivity. And as that volumes grow and we continue to look at how we can intensify the land use and labor use, that's when we are trying to urge and nudge companies, third-party logistic players, warehouses, operators to introduce more of this automation. And there's value in that. Companies who have done so earlier than others would actually reflect to us that yes, it's going to be costly. The return on investment is going to be 3, 4, 5 years out, but the ability to deliver with precision, as per what you say, is something that they've gotten out of their investment. So their customers are a lot happier because you are able to deliver the goods to your customers, your end customers, end consumers, a lot more without as much errors and mistakes. And you are able to scale, especially when you have, in Asia, I'm not sure in the US you have that, but 11/11 in China, as well as across Southeast Asia. You've just had Black Friday and Cyber Monday. So I think you've got, a lot of peaks and surges that's going to be very difficult to manage just with labor. So I think companies are starting to open up their minds. It's no longer just about saving on labor costs. It's also about delivering to how you're going to deliver in a more dynamic environment going forward.
That's exactly what I'm seeing. That folks are basically like, look, I'll pay a premium for exact predictability, right? One thing that I know that a lot of folks are very curious about right now, and they were even before the talk of the Great Resignation here and all of that, is finding good global talent. What does it take to find someone who really knows where and how to move things all throughout Southeast Asia? I'm assuming that that person is paid very well and lives in Singapore, or can be easily talked into being there. But what is the market for that kind of person like?
Yeah, that question, yeah, is a really broad one actually, because it really depends on what role you're trying to fill. But you're right in saying that if, let's say, you're trying to find someone who's talented, knowledgeable, would have exposure and experience in the region, you may find someone quite easily from Singapore, because you could see Singapore as kind of the capital of Southeast Asia, right? So a lot of Southeast Asians would at some point in time, whether they're from Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, work in the regional headquarters based in Singapore, or work in a control tower that's being set up by a multinational based in Singapore. Even for startups, you would see that many of the startups would gravitate towards Singapore when they're looking for funding, when they're looking to expand their business across the region, because it's a good hub for you to do that. So I wouldn't say that you can only find the Singaporeans for these roles. In fact,
I'm not saying so.
Yeah,
but there are plenty of Americans that I've talked to in Singapore that they were in China in the 80s.
Yeah, so you've got a kind of a hot pot of talent from around the region, but also across the world. You know, whether is it from Europe or the US, and you will be able to find that kind of talent out of Singapore, because they probably have done a stint in China. They've probably ran a plant in Vietnam, or for certain supply chain related roles when it comes to sourcing or supplier management. You may have someone who have really worked closely with a Taiwanese supplier, or someone in Indonesia who's doing apparel manufacturing. So I think a great starting point will obviously be in Singapore. And then when you're looking to, if let's say you're planting your flag first in Singapore and then moving into new markets in Indonesia, Vietnam, it's always great that you find someone who's from that country, who understands the culture, who speaks the language. And I would say that even if you talk about how some of these economies perhaps are still developing and not as developed in Singapore, but just the fact of the matter that they have a huge population size, you're going to be able to find a kind of talent that you need in those countries as well. So I think great starting point in Singapore. Eventually you need boots on the ground. You have to find those talent in markets from those countries who will help you navigate the cultural nuances, who will help you expand that network that you need from their countries themselves.
What would you say are the biggest trends that you're seeing on the ground when it comes to everything that's under your control, right? Which is supply chains, connectivity within the region. Like, what's really the juice?
No, I love this question because it's something that's so interesting to observe even if I'm not involved in the this domain, right? So for everyone's benefit, I cover the supply chain and connectivity team at EDP. Obviously, looking at connectivity, how we are having those physical connections to other markets and production bases, but also in the world of supply chain management, where we are looking at how executives are thinking about delivering their supply chain strategies, especially in such a dynamic environment today. So, when you talk about supply chain, a lot of people are talking about, okay, the move from just in time to just in case, right? From supply chain efficiency to supply chain resilience. I don't think it's one or the other. I think companies will still have to look at how to be as lean and efficient as possible. But now the complexity is that the past way of managing your supply chains, where you keep it super lean, is probably over. Initially, we probably thought that with the onset of the pandemic, okay, that's just one disruption. And then you've just got, such frequent disruptions these days, right? We thought that things were going to get better, and you have Omicron knocking on our door. Even before this, you have seen the, kind of the energy crisis. If you look at Vietnam, which was supposed to be the alternative to China, they have, were in lockdown for a considerable time. So I think for some people in supply chain, it's just so difficult to assume that, things are going to return to where they were pre-pandemic. So now I think what we are seeing is that companies are starting to realize that we've got to mitigate some of these risks, but we can't be creating redundancies everywhere. So just because you have only one supplier in China, it doesn't mean that you then need to have an alternative in Vietnam, an alternative in Singapore, an alternative in Indonesia, because that's going to be super costly. There's no economies of scale with that. So I think folks within the supply chain domain are having to think really hard, how do you mitigate that risk without escalating the cost of doing business, of running a business? So I think
that's the huge question, right? I mean, there's a lot of regional political issues that we won't get too much into, right?
Yeah.
And it's causing a lot of people to ask these questions, and it's been going on for quite a while. And at first people thought that, yeah, you mentioned Vietnam, and I remember that coming up early on in the Obama administration, and then they had those central bank overheat. It didn't take much, and so then they learned from that, and so they've been getting a lot better. But that seems to be the big question, is like, what's the right mix? And that's kind of why I'm asking, right? Like, who's getting it right?
Yeah, so my thinking is that the ones who can get it right are the ones who are able to it's not just about diversification. So diversification is definitely on the cards, but you need to figure a way out, how do you give sufficient business to your backup supplier? How do you maintain that relationship with that next supplier? That means that you need to diversify the source, but you need to find a way that you can activate them when required. So I think it's about agility, and it also plays in part to your own in-house manufacturing network. So do I go build manufacturing plants everywhere because the port in in that country is going to be congested, so I need to build another plant in another location? It's probably not possible and feasible. So it's more about agility. Maybe it's not about having 5 manufacturing plants, but it's about having 2 manufacturing plants, perhaps with the ability, and that's where I 4.0 comes in, with the ability to switch products. So if I don't recall wrongly, the Crocs, the manufacturer of these footwear that we wear back in fashion now.
I am wearing some right now.
Great. So So you're in fashion. But anyway, so the point is that Crocs has managed to do that pretty well, I think. You will read from their quarterly earnings that they have done pretty well because they've managed the supply chains, that they're able to activate their secondary sources. So if I'm thinking for if I own, and if I have manufacturing plants, I'm going to think about whether my other manufacturing plant can, produce, product B when I'm primarily producing product A. Is that the ability to switch and be flexible? Just unlike many companies who switch to producing sanitizers, I was producing perfumes, but now I'm producing sanitizers at the height of the pandemic. So I think having that agility would be important. It's not just about diversification. It's about the ability to switch suppliers quickly, be able to switch in products. And in fact, we are talking a lot about the supply side, but what about the demand side? Because you're seeing consumers who can, because of something that goes viral on Twitter, people could actually pick up a product more quickly than another product. Are you able to be agile in meeting the dynamic consumer demand? That's going to be evolving and changing very quickly. So I think agility would be the word that I would use, how companies can achieve that within their supply chains.
So how does what's the best way for a company to develop that kind of in-house expertise of not necessarily knowing where everything is all the time, because I don't think that anyone can do that, but knowing where to find the folks who do? Obviously, people should call Singapore EDP and talk to Chuen, but developing that kind of a capability on the fly, because depending on what's going on in the world and where it's happening, different needs are coming up, right? What does it take for a company to get to that? I mean, it's clearly not just a revenue thing. Like, you have to be Unilever to be able to do stuff like this. No, you said Crocs, right? Yes, it's large enough, but it's not like major. So what are the characteristics of the companies that you see that are getting that right, and who's leading that? Like, what's inside the organization that really makes it work? And who do they talk to out there? Yeah.
When we speak with companies, we actually see that entire spectrum of companies, those who are really good at this and those who are just managing it. The key difference is those who are on top of their game or progressive. It is really because they realize that supply chain management is something that's beyond cost cutting. It's going to be what we call a revenue enablement. You can sell all the products that you need, but if you can't deliver, you're not going to make the revenue. So the companies who realize that, and you've named a few, obviously the larger ones are more prominent, the likes of P&G, Unilever, Amazon, they're really good at that. So we won't talk about those at the top tier because they're probably already leading edge. But when we see companies who are starting to move into implementing that agility within their supply chains, it's firstly that realization or awareness that this needs to be done, especially in a business where we know that maybe certain business you don't really need to have a super agile supply chain. But for businesses where you know that you've got to deliver to customers really quickly, you've got dynamic demand, you know that you've got supply side constraints or supply side risks, the awareness that you have to sort it out is the first step. Because if you don't realize that, you're always going to deprioritize people who are running your supply chains, right? The folks who are in procurement, the folks who are in planning, the folks who are in logistics. So once you come to that awareness, it's then realizing that it's important, and you have to figure out what's the next steps. Many companies have realized that, okay, one of the things that we needed to do is to make sure that we go more digital. Can we make information flow a little bit more seamless across the silos, between planning to procurement, from manufacturing to logistics? So it's painful, but the companies who are undertaking those transformation, and it's digital transformation, is what we call supply chain transformation, really ripping out the okay, maybe not ripping out, that would be not the right word, but looking at the enterprise systems, looking at how they are running their supply chains and trying to enable more data flow. And that starts also from visibility from suppliers. How do you get suppliers to tell you about where they are and their suppliers? So we talk about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. And you have to decide, there's probably no need to have entire visibility. You're not trying to know everything, but knowing enough such that you can make decisions. So a lot of the second steps that companies are taking is to digitize, invest in certain software solutions that can enable that visibility. But I'll go further than that. I think the third thing, or in parallel to the second thing, it is how do you start building those relationships with your suppliers? Many companies who won during the pandemic or who have managed their supply chains during the pandemic, and if you can look at, the automotive sector, between, those who had done well in the chip shortage period, the Toyotas, the Teslas versus the GMs, the Fords, they probably had very good supplier relationships or arrangements such that they can secure that limited chip supply that they needed to continue production. So I think companies will have to start thinking about how they partner with their suppliers. So it's no longer just transactional, but you have a relationship, you have a partnership where when things go south, you can depend on some of these suppliers to continue supplying into your network. So I think, those 2 or 3 things will be the characteristics of companies who have got it pretty right over the last 18 months.
You are the 3rd or 4th person today, not in the same way, not under the same circumstances, but you've said like how important it is to get to know your suppliers really well, whether it's in the context of avoiding risk, whether it's in the context of sustainability and ESG and how they are changing as companies themselves, right? Like what's their vision for the future and what do they want to be able to say about how they're servicing their customers. Getting to know what is going on with the supplier is and getting to know them is a big priority. I have not heard that sort of offered in the same way with the same degree of uniformity and urgency. It's really quite something. Which leads me to the next thing, which is, a lot of companies, you said 2nd to 3rd tier suppliers, but where so often like things come up with like ESG related issues, it can often happen. Sometimes it's in the 1st tier, the 2nd tier, for sure. And then you find out about it and then you're like, I made my brand promises. I got to do something about this. But then sometimes it happens out of view from the folks that are, beyond your visibility. Is that changing much? What do you see going on with the awareness, like culturally and in terms of enthusiasm? The personal level awareness of what it means to be focused on ESG type compliance and willingness.
To be candid, I think for Southeast Asia, or maybe even Asia in general, this is something that is relatively slow or nascent. I think the good thing is, I think there's a lot more awareness and it's going to gain traction, especially when the larger brands, especially the brands from the North America, the brands from Europe, and basically larger brands in and around the world starts to be pressured both by investors and consumers to take a closer look at ESG practices. We had a COP26, just recently, and there has been greater momentum towards sustainability. So if you talk about, firstly, okay, we can talk about carbon for instance. So carbon, I think there's a lot more motivation, from countries to, cope with, to manage, to reduce carbon emissions. The unfortunate thing is a lot of us are still focusing a lot on scope 1 emissions, right? Your direct emissions. But what we are seeing is that companies, especially the more progressive ones, are starting to say, hey, we need to go down our supply chain because, the bulk of our emissions, right, from our product actually doesn't come directly from, the guy at the top. It's really because, in the production process, in the transportation process, you accumulate it and generate that much carbon. So I can't recall the numbers, but I think, for instance, in the apparel sector, I think 60, 70, 80% comes from the supply chains, the scope 3 emissions rather than scope 1. So if you want to be serious in tackling that problem, most companies would have to go down their supply chains. And a lot of the supply chain is in Asia. So the pressure—
That's why I was asking about it.
No, so the pressure—
No, I feel you.
Say, the countries have a role to play, the governments have a role to play. But if we go back to the source of the problem, a lot of it also starts from whether consumers are willing to pay that green premium, right? That's one. Two, the second thing is whether companies are willing to forego some profits in order to green their supply chains, right? So everyone is responsible. I'm not saying that it's just the governments, it's just consumer, or it's just the companies at the top. I think throughout the entire ecosystem, the consumer must be willing to pay the green premium. Am I still going to want to have my 24-hour, or I can't recall in the US how quickly Amazon can deliver to you, but do I want to have that next day delivery? Or am I comfortable with a 7-day delivery? But if I were to ask for a next day delivery and it's not optimized for carbon, then the question is, am I willing to pay more? Or am I going to just want to still be enjoying free shipping? So consumers have a role to play. But when the companies, when you talk about brand owner, they have to go down to the suppliers. Sometimes I think they close one eye or two eyes when it comes to what's happening with their suppliers. And that pressure has to come down from the top, because as the brand owner, paying the suppliers in that relationship as a customer, you have the right to demand for that. But when you demand for that, what's going to happen is that it will be an increase in cost. So that's one problem to be solved. But the other problem to be solved, and I think that's where we are starting to think about whether Singapore has a role to play, is that even if you are paying for that green premium within your suppliers, are you able to verify that they are being green, right? Is the level of transparency, the ability to verify their claims there? And therein, we think that at some point, we could also potentially be a hub for companies to drive that transparency. Any way you're doing quality management, you're trying to make sure that the suppliers that you're on board are, of a certain quality, is adding another metric, the ESG column, right? Is it, are they ethical in their labor practices? Are they, sustainable in how they produce? Are they, using renewable energy as far as possible? So I think in the future, hopefully in the near future, we will have a role to play in helping companies, companies basing their executives in Singapore to manage their suppliers, not just for ensuring their performance, ensuring their quality, ensuring that they can deliver, but also ensuring that they are aligned with all the ESG KPIs that companies are having. And I think it will take the entire ecosystem. I think it will start from companies being able to drive that. I visited a third-party logistics players yesterday. So I was really encouraged because they were actually translating whatever they had in their corporate annual report into practice on the ground. So it wasn't just, the usual kind of greenwashing that's being done, right? They were actually taking some of the goals that they had at the corporate level and applying to their Singapore facility. Are we on track for, meeting our targets? And trickling down, they are they use a bunch of truckers and hauliers within the country. They are actually piloting biodiesel trucks. They are also trying to deploy more electric vehicles for delivery. So they are kind of walking the talk. They are getting their supplier base to green. And I asked them, it may increase in cost of doing business. Are you willing to pay for that? And are you willing to pay your suppliers for that? And they said they are, and they are looking for suppliers who are willing to come on board. So I think that's where I think companies, especially up the value chain, are able to influence and make things happen. And as the government, I think what we have to do is to facilitate, build the necessary ecosystem. If they can't find the EV models, can we bring in the EV models? If they can't find the biodiesel, can we ensure that there's a supply of biodiesel or for aviation SAF, sustainable aviation fuel? So I think it will be a collaboration that we need to do both between public and private, and hopefully that would capitalize that movement within our region. It's still a long journey. It's taken a long while for, say, Europe or North America to get to where it is today in terms of how they're thinking about ESG. So it will take some time for Asia to catch up. But I'm optimistic we'll move towards that eventually.
Yeah, I think, and you've given me a good sense of like indirectly showing just like where Asia is right now on this, right? Like I remember seeing it, and India had gone through its own environmentalist movement for its own special reasons, and still, there was a lot of work to be done in these areas too. But that was kind of like a standout as far as I could tell in Asia. And without that sort of weird cultural blip in the 70s, I don't know if they would have that kind of mentality now, right? Or without that, it would have been there through the whole way, and something that lends itself well into the current cultural questions, right? So that's what kind of why I wondered about that, like when there have been times when I've been in, Asian households or parts of Asia, and if you tell them, something, I'm not gonna, I won't be eating meat this time or something like that, and they're like, you vegetarian? And I'm like, yeah. So just a little bit, you know what I mean? Like it's the just a little bit part that I think that can get folks in trouble sometimes with ESG or sustainability. It's the assumption of flexibility in certain cases. But if it's not even there, if it's really, really nascent and it's just getting off the ground, and it sounds like that's what you're saying, then it takes a lot of attention and a lot of effort and showing up and educating the supplier, like, hey, this is why this matters, and this is what we got to do to make sure that everything is okay by the people that we are serving. And if we don't, here's what it looks like. And
while it's nascent, I wouldn't be totally caught surprised if all of a sudden 3 years down the road you see that this is taking off. I'll give you 2 examples, right? So when we look at China, and we all know that China is quite a large polluter, but in China, I haven't visited China for a while, but my colleague who used to be based there, she managed to get into China last couple of months. She was saying that just over the last 3 years she's not been there, she was amazed by the number of electric vehicles on the streets. They've just like gone, kind of from 0 to 20% or something like that in 2 or 3 years. So some countries will have the ability to switch on the lights immediately with respect to ESG. And then the other thing that I wanted to share is, if you look at some company, the power that companies have, especially larger brands have, is that if your supplier base is in Southeast Asia or in Asia, and if you're serious about going down this ESG route, they will have to follow, because you are paying, they are your suppliers, you are their customers. And I don't quite like to use this example because it doesn't seem to shed a good light on the region. But I think if you picked up the news, Dyson recently just kind of terminated its agreement with one of its suppliers in Malaysia because of some concerns around how they were with labor practices. Obviously, the supplier is challenging that. I thought to raise this because it's quite powerful, right? So if you have a brand like Dyson saying that, okay, I'm not going to do business with you anymore because of labor issues, then it's going to send a signal down to the supplier. They are going to look for a supplier who's compliant. And that would change the environment entirely. That would change the operating environment within Malaysia. It will also, I mean, obviously it's just one case, but if you have more and more companies who are walking the talk and saying that, okay, I'm serious about ESG and I'm going to look at my suppliers and I'm going to help them upgrade and level up and get to where they should be, then you would have the region also moving along. It's got to be pressure, or I would say pressure maybe is not a very positive word, but kind of bring people on board, right?
Yeah, tell them what you need, because they've got pressure, right? Like, for every one of the suppliers out there that's going to be like, what? We've got folks out here who have been, ending up in the press because they find, their customers find out like, hey, you're not actually fair trade. What's going on here?
No, and I think the other way to look at it is maybe doing good would be good for business as well. So
which would?
If you are doing good, so you're not just doing good for the planet, or you're not just doing good because you're pressured, but doing good in the long term would be good for business, right? And we talk about EDB, we recently launched a campaign called Business for Good. So hopefully we're able to get business to do good for people, do good for planet. But at the end of it, I think it will become a good business, because if you are leading the pack in terms of ESG practices, you're going to win more contracts than those that don't eventually, right? So we are hearing from for instance, the third-party logistic players that we talk to, one of the reasons why they are also accelerating their adoption is because their customers, the luxury sector, the FMCG sector, they are actually saying that, okay, you've got to green the way that you transport the goods. If not, you're not going to renew your contract. And that gets them started.
I bet it does.
It will. So I think we will see that movement coming to Asia. Obviously, everyone is hoping that this will happen faster than, but we've got to take small steps, right? So I think what we'll do on our end is to try to create and enable, create an environment that can enable this out of Singapore for the region.
And I know you will. Y'all are the gold standard of economic development organizations. And I'm really delighted that you were able to do this with us. And yeah, I put you guys in the newsletter yesterday and told folks a little bit about what you do.
Thanks
You
for
saw
that?
Yeah. No, everyone I've talked to over there has been just super helpful, and really a great way of doing business, I think. So I think with that, we've reached the end of the day. Laura, your co-panelist, she said that she was really terribly sorry about missing the session because she was not feeling well at all. She said that she was in no condition to present herself or the topic. So we've all been there. I've been there myself. So
unfortunately, the attendees will have to listen to this dialogue between you and me.
Oh no, I thought it was great too. Laura is a lot of fun. She is very energetic and knows her topics like the back of her hand. So we'll have to do a redo at some point. But Chuen, I really appreciate you making time for this, especially that early in the morning. Really great to have you here. So thank you.
Thanks.